iPhone has come a long way since its humble beginnings in 2007. iOS has gone from looking like this to looking like this. The home button has disappeared, 2G has evolved to 5G, iPhone cameras are absurdly big these days, and Apple's processors have gotten so powerful that they eventually put them in their computers. While the change we've seen has been monumental, it's been a long road to get here, and the reality is whether you love iPhones or hate them, Apple can generally be relied upon to produce a solid new smartphone every single year. There's a reason they've always sold as well as they have, and can consistently compete with the vast quantities of Android phones on the market, even despite their typically high price tags. But Apple's not infallible, they can make mistakes, and every once in a while we'll see an iPhone that qualifies as just that. Hey, how's it going? I'm Josh from 91 Tech, and in the nearly 2 decades since the first iPhone, we've slowly accumulated about 46 different iterations of iPhone in total, though that's if we count different size options as their own models. If we merge those phones to singular generations, we're looking at about 30 iPhones in total. Again, most of these iPhones can be considered at least anywhere from solid to even outright great, but there are a few outliers that just don't hold up to that standard. So today, I thought it would be fun to go through every single iPhone ever to this point and ask the question, what is the worst iPhone ever? Okay, so we're going to begin by going through every single individual iPhone model, talking about a few strengths and weaknesses, and then determining whether or not they could potentially compete as one of the worst iPhones of all time. Once we've narrowed things down to a few select models, we'll compare them head to head and see which manages to stand out from the crowd as the all-time crappiest iPhone. As for what our criteria will include, it's going to vary, but generally I think it's worth discussing things like how innovative the phone was, whether or not it was good value for the time, a good experience, the longevity of each device. It'll be tougher once we get to the more recent iPhones, since we don't really know how many updates Apple's going to give them, or if there could be even a potential hardware flaw that hasn't cropped up yet, but we'll do our best with what we have. So for now, let's get to figuring out which iPhones could qualify as the worst of the worst, starting with the first iPhone from 2007. It should be pretty obvious that this is not the worst iPhone ever, and if anything, it's one of the greatest. Heck, if I was doing a list of the best smartphones of all time, Android included, I would probably put this one at the top. And it's pretty obvious why, right? Smartphones that came before the first iPhone are completely foreign to what they are today, whereas this phone has continued to form the foundation of practically every iPhone and Android device that's come since. From the multi-touch display to the software, even the grid layout, you give an original iPhone to anybody on the street, and they will inherently know more or less how to use it because it is so incredibly familiar to smartphones of today. This iPhone changed everything, but if we're being fair and judging this in the context of competing with future models, there are some pretty major flaws worth considering. For one, this phone is generally dubbed as the iPhone 2G for the fact that it can only handle 2G networks, which for 2007, that wasn't great, as 3G was already becoming commonplace. This phone is slow, particularly on its final version of iOS, or actually iPhone OS 3. The aluminum build feels premium, but scratches and dents really easily, and there's a level of polish that's lacking compared to newer devices. The first iPhone was also very expensive when it first came out, only for Apple to reduce the price after a few months. The 4GB model was ditched, and the 8GB model dropped from $600 to $400 US. This was September 2007. iPhone had only come out in June. Now, this was overall a consumer-friendly move that did probably help the iPhone gain massive ground in the emerging smartphone market, but it still screwed over early adopters, resulting in a bit of a PR disaster, and ultimately Steve Jobs and Apple would end up giving a $100 credit to those who had paid full price. Despite some missteps, the first iPhone was still spectacular and is the reason Apple is now worth over $3.5 trillion. January 2007, they were worth around $72 billion. So yeah, this isn't one of the worst iPhones ever, and I don't think that's any surprise. In 2008, we would see the second iPhone called the iPhone 3G, named after the addition of 3G networking. The phone was now in a glossy plastic build that may appear a bit less premium, but the price tag did reflect this, only costing $200 with a 2-year contract, $400 down from the original iPhone's price point, which is obviously significant. In terms of upgrades, there was very little new here, and I think that's okay. This was basically just the first iPhone in a plastic shell with 3G at a much cheaper price tag. It was an important iPhone to help grow Apple's customer base, albeit it is a pretty unexciting model, all things considered. It would get until iOS 4 and was also extremely slow on its final version. Actually trying to use one of these things nowadays is very painful, though I don't know why you would want to do that in the first place. The poor software optimization and performance does hurt the 3G, but it was only the second iPhone, and I think it does deserve some leeway. I'd say this is at best a mid-tier iPhone, but a stepping stone to greater things coming right around the corner. The first S-model iPhone, the iPhone 3GS, released in 2009 and reused the same design as the iPhone 3G. This would have been disappointing for some, but the good news was that on the inside, the 3GS revamped everything, bringing double the speeds, a far better camera, and just an all-around much better experience. This is when iPhone was really starting to get big and find its footing, and the 3GS is probably the first iPhone I can comfortably say has aged really well. It got updates all the way until iOS 6 and is actually fast on its final version. It performed shockingly well considering the age, and especially considering how slow those first couple iPhones became. While there was still plenty of room for innovation, this was a solid refinement of the iPhone formula, and if you bought this phone 15 years ago, you were in for a good time. This is definitely not one of the worst iPhones ever. In June 2010, we would see the final iPhone presented by Steve Jobs, the iPhone 4. First, props to Apple for fixing the naming scheme after the confusing mess that was the first 3 models. I'm sure this will never get messy again, and iPhone names will forever make sense after this point. Second, holy moly, there was so much new with the iPhone 4. It still stands today as one of the biggest iPhone upgrades of all time. We got what I think is the first truly premium iPhone design, with a gorgeous glass and stainless steel build, the sharp Retina display that blew everything else in 2010 out of the water, Apple's first custom chipset in the A4, a front-facing camera along with FaceTime, and so much more. Everything about the iPhone 4 made for almost the perfect smartphone. It was still small at only 3.5 inches, but in 2010 this was far more acceptable than it would become a few short years later. Another underrated innovation was the integrated antennas, but of course with them came AntennaGate, where your coverage could drop if you gripped your iPhone 4 in a particular way. This became a huge media story and quickly eroded a lot of the goodwill towards Apple and the iPhone 4, leaving a bad taste in the mouth of many customers. But Apple did end up giving a free bumper case along with refunds for anyone who wanted one, and I think that sort of response is very respectable. Aside from AntennaGate, the iPhone 4 would eventually become quite slow on iOS 7. Not unusably slow, but it performs a good bit worse than the iPhone 3GS, and as a former iPhone 4 owner myself, I can confirm it wasn't always the most pleasant experience. Still, all things considered, the iPhone 4 is easily one of the greatest and most innovative smartphones of all time, so let's keep things moving. Announced a single day before Steve Jobs would pass away on October 4th, 2011, the iPhone 4S had a lot of hype surrounding it, and some disappointment when it used the same design as the iPhone 4, though in hindsight I feel like this should have been expected after the 3GS. Still, the smartphone industry was moving quickly over the past year, and the 3.5-inch display was starting to feel awfully small, though thankfully we did get a lot of good stuff to help make up for it. The speeds and cameras saw some big upgrades, and we also saw the first mainstream personal AI assistant in Siri, which was very hyped at the time and can be credited as one of the major reasons artificial intelligence has quickly become as big as it is today. In 2011, this was a really great smartphone, and it would also receive more software updates than any iPhone before it, from iOS 5 all the way to iOS 9, making for an unprecedented 5-year lifespan in total. Now unfortunately, the iPhone 4S was already super slow on iOS 8, and by the time iOS 9 hit it, it would become practically unusable. This is, aside from the iPhone 3G, easily the slowest iPhone experience ever, and there's really no excuse for Apple here. They knew what they were doing by this point, and I still don't understand why they gave it so many updates. There's some benefit to it, like further app support, but if you owned an iPhone 4S past 2015, you were in for a very rough ride. As much as I love this phone, and I do think it's maybe a bit underrated in some aspects, there's enough reason here that I think the 4S could potentially qualify as one of the worst iPhones of all time. So finally, we've got our first contender for the next round. In 2012, we would see the iPhone 5, which shook up the design and finally increased the screen size to a taller 4 inches. This was a really ideal form factor for a lot of people, though it was significantly smaller still than a lot of phablets that were emerging around this time. Even so, there was so much to love with the iPhone 5. The aluminum and glass design is possibly the most premium and beautiful of any iPhone even to this day, and while many of the upgrades were modest, they just managed to really refine the overall experience. Lightning was a huge addition over the big 30-pin charging ports of old, and iOS 6 absolutely flew on this thing. It's crazy fast. We would get updates through to iOS 10, which thankfully performs pretty well on here, especially compared to the iPhone 4 and 4S on their final versions. Having a full gigabyte of RAM here is definitely helping. All in all, the iPhone 5 is arguably the final classic iPhone, for reasons we'll see shortly, and while it may have been a bit too small for some users, I do think Apple did a good job pleasing both groups by making the aspect ratio 16:9 and not increasing the width, so it was still easily usable with one hand. The iPhone 5 is one of the best iPhones ever made in my eyes, and not worthy of consideration for this video. In 2013, we would see two iPhones, and we'll start with the lower-end model, the iPhone 5C. This year marked a turning point for Apple. There would be a distinct shift from the Steve Jobs era of old to the Johnny Ive and Tim Cook era of new, with iOS 7 bringing a complete revamp to the user interface of iOS. The iPhone 5C would basically be the opposite of everything iPhone had strived to be in past years, coming in a polycarbonate plastic shell featuring a plethora of colors, and it was meant to be a more budget-oriented model that would replace the iPhone 5 outright. It would share all its specs with the 2012 iPhone 5. It really was basically just the iPhone 5 in a plastic shell, and it came in at a price tag only $100 cheaper than the 5S, the same price the iPhone 5 normally would have been if Apple hadn't discontinued it. So what we had here was a far less premium iPhone 5 without any real added value, and a phone lacking any of the new fun features that came on the iPhone 5S. If it isn't already clear, the iPhone 5C definitely qualifies as one of the worst iPhones ever. It's a phone that has a lot of charm. This was my second iPhone personally, as I bought it refurbished back in 2014 and really liked it, but you really can't get around the horrible value proposition and complete and utter lack of innovation. This felt like a cash grab, marketed towards millennials and the sort of hipster market that would buy this iPhone purely for the Apple logo and because it had some flashy colors. It was just too out there compared to Apple's previous devices, and again, while I personally have a lot of nostalgia and love for the 5C, there's no question that it should move on to the next round and may in fact be the worst iPhone ever made. Alongside the iPhone 5C, we would see the true successor to the iPhone 5 in the iPhone 5S, which brought an array of big upgrades, most prominently a third gold color option, of course. But there was also Touch ID, Apple's A7 chipset, which was the first 64-bit processor in a smartphone ever. This really was an innovative phone. For 2013, the 4-inch display was pretty dang small compared to the rest of the Android competition, but this was a divisive subject at the time. Truth was, a lot of people still really preferred the smaller form factor, but I do think Apple should have considered giving their customers more options earlier. With iOS 7, the 5S was absolutely gorgeous, and it just managed to refine that iPhone 5 experience without feeling like too dramatic a change, unlike the 5C. Everything about this iPhone was nearly perfect, at least outside of the size, and it would receive updates all the way until iOS 12, making for 6 years of full support, beating Apple's own previous record. And somehow, iOS 12 actually runs really well on here, even all these years later, relatively speaking at least, and it's wildly impressive. It's hard to believe the 4S disaster was only a couple generations ago. The iPhone 5S is easily one of the best iPhones ever made, and so let's keep things moving. In 2014, we would see two new iPhones, the iPhone 6 and 6 Plus. To keep this video straightforward, we're going to merge multiple size options into a singular generation. What was new this year is pretty obvious from the get-go. The 6 and 6 Plus massively increased the size of iPhone all the way from 4 inches to either 4.7 or 5.5 inches. This was a very necessary change, as much as some users still clung to the smaller form factor. Phablets on the Android side had seen wildly increasing popularity, and Apple needed to be able to compete. The design here was very different, with a more curved, rounded aluminum build and plastic antenna bands stretching across the phone. At the time, I really loved this design, but in hindsight, I've always found it to be one of the weaker ones from Apple. It just doesn't compete with the iPhone 5 and 5S for me, the glass and aluminum, but this is mainly subjective. What isn't subjective is the quality of the build, as Apple used a low-grade aluminum that didn't take much pressure to, well, bend, hence the PR nightmare that was Bendgate. This is probably still what this phone is most remembered for, and it's ridiculous Apple was willing to release a phone with so many issues. While I don't think physically trying to bend a phone is a good test of durability, the reality was that over time, whether the phone actually bent or not, you had a lot of hardware issues like touch disease that cropped up and could render your device basically useless. Not to say there wasn't a lot of good. This is probably the most mixed iPhone ever in terms of good and bad qualities. It brought NFC and Apple Pay, which was big, and thanks to the larger sizes, the iPhone 6 and 6 Plus are still a decade later the best-selling smartphones of all time, and it's not particularly close. We would see updates here to iOS 12, which, yeah, it's the same as the 5S despite being a year newer, but at least the performance stayed decent. Overall, I do think these phones qualify as potentially some of the worst iPhones of all time, just because there is so much with the hardware issues, and they will move on to the next round. Released in 2015, the iPhone 6S and 6S Plus would work to fix the missteps of the iPhone 6, while also improving the tech specs and hardware significantly. We saw a higher grade aluminum that made this one of the most durable iPhones ever, a new rose gold color option, 3D touch, which was cool, second generation Touch ID that was much faster, a big camera upgrade, and the phone also just was in general much faster with the A9 chipset. There was a lot to love here, and these phones really were just the iPhone 6 done right. Finally, the 6S would get updates all the way until iOS 15, 2015, making for a full 7 years of support, setting another new standard for iPhones moving forward. And don't forget the iPhone 6 only got to iOS 12, so that's pretty crazy. My only real complaint with these phones is that they started with only 16 gigabytes, which was pretty dang absurd for 2015. But overall, the 6S and 6S Plus were fantastic iPhones and, in my opinion, criminally underrated, if only for their longevity. In March 2016, we would see something brand new with the iPhone SE, standing for Special Edition. Since the iPhone 6, there was a lot of users who felt ostracized by the bigger phone sizes, and Apple made the brilliant move to try to capitalize on this, as well as the more budget-oriented market. The SE would amount to essentially a shrunk-down iPhone 6S, rocking the same design as the 5S, but with the A9 chipset and the new 12-megapixel rear camera, all for a much cheaper price point. This was a fantastic iPhone, and a weirdly consumer-friendly model to come from Apple. It would also receive iOS support all the way to iOS 15, which was just amazing to see. The fact that this form factor can still be even remotely usable so many years later is truly impressive, and all in all, the iPhone SE is in no way one of the worst iPhones ever made, but in fact, probably one of the best. In fall 2016, we would see the iPhone 7 and 7 Plus, and it's here where we see a real turning point in Apple's patterns for iPhone upgrades. These being a full new number rather than an S model would imply we would get a much different design and some upgrades of real substance, but by 2016, smartphone progress was already beginning to slow down, and so the iPhone 7 really didn't look a whole lot different from the 6 and 6S, only bringing some new colors and a more refined, cleaner look. And there were a few big new features of note. The main one was the telephoto camera lens purely on the 7 Plus, which allowed for 2x zoom and portrait mode photos. This honestly was a big deal, given how multiple camera lenses on any flagship smartphone is a must these days, and this was one of the first devices to do it. Aside from that, we saw IP67 water resistance, dual firing speakers, some other minor stuff, and of course, no more headphone jack. This is still one of the most controversial moves Apple has ever made, and I've always been staunchly against it. Apple released AirPods at the same time as this iPhone, and as much as I love my AirPods, I do think this was a pretty scummy move, clearly done to boost sales for the wireless earbuds. It wasn't particularly courageous no matter how many times Apple told you otherwise. Plus, we now had dongles, which were just a real pain. You couldn't even charge your iPhone and use headphones at the same time. I think considering how anti-consumer this move was, in combination with how relatively small the iPhone 7 felt as an upgrade, plus the fact that this phone didn't get past iOS 15, same as the 6S, I do believe the iPhone 7 is worthy of continuing on to the next round as potentially the worst iPhone ever made. In 2017, we'd once again see two new iPhones, beginning with the iPhone 8 and 8 Plus launching in September. If the iPhone 7 was more like the iPhone 6SS, then this would basically be the iPhone 6SSS. It had a new glass and aluminum build, which allowed for wireless charging, and we also saw fast charging, though of course you would have to buy the bigger brick separately because it's Apple. We had some typical technical improvements that we get every year, and this really was just a stopgap iPhone between the iPhone 7 and what was coming next. And that's totally okay. I think this is a solid iPhone, if a bit boring and nowhere near the worst of all time. Finally, in November 2017, we would see the biggest iPhone upgrade since the iPhone 4 with the iPhone 10, written as X, apparently representing the 10-year anniversary of iPhone. The iPhone 10 was definitely worthy of such a title, removing the home button and bringing a near bezel-less beautiful OLED display with only that notch intruding, which hosted the Face ID sensors, replacing Touch ID outright. We saw a completely new way of traversing iOS with the gesture system, and I absolutely love the flow that Apple brought with this. Everything feels so smooth and satisfying to use, and it's been mostly unchanged over the years. The design here also harkened back to the iPhone 4 with glass and stainless steel, bringing iPhone back to a whole new level of premium. And while there was only two color options in silver and space gray, there's very little to complain about here without nitpicking. It was maybe on the smaller end with no plus or max size option yet, but aside from that, it was just about perfect. It would get to iOS 16 and performs quite well on it. Battery life was never very good, and this was the first $1,000 iPhone, but let's be real, if any iPhone has ever been worth $1,000, it was this one. It was unlike anything else on the market at the time and showed Apple was still capable of innovation when they wanted to be. Ultimately, this is one of the best iPhones ever made, and I think it's pretty obvious it should not qualify for the next round. I mean, this is the phone that gave us Animoji. What more could you possibly want? In 2018, we would again see two iPhones launch, and this is a pattern that's going to continue from here on out. The iPhone XR was a sort of in-between model from the iPhone 8 and the iPhone X. If there was any iPhone that could have been called the 9, this would be it. It had an LCD screen rather than OLED, which allowed Apple to price it at a more reasonable $750 to compete with the higher end of the mid-range smartphone market. The screen was a really nice size of 6.1 inches, and the specs were all the same as Apple's $1,000 flagship. The camera was also the same as on the new iPhone XS, though we only had the main wide lens. The main complaints with this phone mostly boil down to the relatively low resolution, which wasn't great, but any controversy here I think was wildly overblown. Reality is, users at the time just didn't care about a slightly lower pixel density than a competing Android when the rest of the phone was as good as it was. The battery life was better than the XS, and we would see updates at least to iOS 18. As of making this video, this 2018 smartphone is still fully supported, and that's just really impressive. This might not be one of the best iPhones ever made, but it is nowhere near the worst. Alongside the iPhone XR, we would see the iPhone XS and XS Max, which built on the iPhone X design and would be the final S model Apple would ever release. At least in name, we've seen plenty of minor upgrades like this in years since. The big new improvements would be the gold color and max size option, along with the faster A12 chipset and slightly better cameras. And that was kind of it. The battery life was surprisingly awful on this phone's. The XS Max, even despite its size, was not very good. Even the XR beat it. This is probably the smallest iPhone upgrade ever to this point in time, but it is helped by at least getting to iOS 18, whereas the 10 only got to iOS 16. This is a difficult phone to judge because I don't think I can call it one of the worst iPhones per se. It's just one of the most boring and mid models we've ever seen. There was nothing special here, nothing really that new, just a much needed second size option and some basic spec bumps. Overall, I think we'll play it safe and let it go on to the next round, but I don't think this will end up being the worst iPhone ever. I do think it deserves the nod to make it to the next round, if only for the terrible naming scheme this year. I mean, people often still call this the iPhone XS, and the word XS isn't exactly something Apple should have been striving for. In 2019, we would finally see Apple once again fix their naming scheme after a couple very confusing years, with the iPhone 11, 11 Pro, and 11 Pro Max. This would be the template for every year onwards. The iPhone 11 was a solid follow-up for the iPhone XR and did basically everything right. The build and design was mainly the same with the 6.1-inch LCD and solid battery life, but now we had two camera lenses on the back, with Apple actually giving us the brand new ultra-wide sensor that was the headlining feature of the more expensive 11 Pro. Yeah, Apple actually giving features from their best flagship on their less expensive model. Can you imagine that? The cameras in general here were much better, particularly in low light with night photography, and we saw the typical spec and performance boosts we get every year. The price also was only $700, $50 down from the XR the previous year, which has got to be one of the last times I can recall Apple actually lowering their prices. While the iPhone 11 may not be the most exciting device in the world, it was an extremely solid entry into the iPhone lineup and one of the better models Apple has ever released. Alongside the iPhone 11, we of course also got that iPhone 11 Pro and 11 Pro Max. These would refine the design of the iPhone X and XS by bringing a gorgeous frosted glass back, along with that beautiful midnight green color that I've always had a personal soft spot for. Like the 11, we had the new ultra-wide camera lens, making for a total of 3 lenses on the back now, a trend that's continued ever since. Those cameras were again much better this year, and the phone in general just felt like a really substantial upgrade after the lackluster iPhone XS. The battery life in particular saw one of the biggest jumps ever, and the 11 Pro Max was the first iPhone I ever owned that I never had to worry about the battery, which I think was just huge. It's nice to have that kind of confidence. All around a great phone, great experience, and an excellent beginning to Apple's new Pro moniker for the iPhone line. 2020 was a strange year for a lot of reasons, but we still saw a bunch of new phones, starting with the second generation iPhone SE that spring. The first iPhone SE had reused an old design with newer hardware, and the second gen did continue that trend, but it wasn't as strong a phone as the original if we're being honest. We had the iPhone 8 build and design with the A13 chipset, which was the same processor as in the iPhone 11, but everything else about the phone carried over from the iPhone 8, even down to the camera, which at this point was 2.5 years old. There was no night mode or anything. Still, the phone came in at $400, which was actually $50 less than Apple had been selling the iPhone 8 for still to this point, which was discontinued outright. This was a really boring iPhone, but still a decent addition to the lineup and a great choice for those not yet ready to move on from the home button. Nothing special, but it's nowhere near the worst iPhone ever. Though slightly delayed, we would see the iPhone 12 and 12 mini release alongside the 12 Pro and 12 Pro Max fall 2020. The iPhone 12 did a lot to shake things up from the iPhone 11. It finally switched to an OLED screen that was basically every bit as good as the Pro model, and slimmed down the bezels while squaring the edges, making for a design very similar to iPhones of today. These were really nice phones, and that new mini model in particular was very unique. There was nothing else like it on the smartphone market, and having a true flagship smartphone in such a compact form factor is something I will always respect. The battery life on the mini was never very good. These are also the phones that got rid of the charging brick, which is just dumb. But overall, the iPhone 12 and 12 mini were really strong iPhones. Plus, they brought 5G networking, which Apple was very proud to tell us in their presentation. The iPhone 12 Pro and 12 Pro Max are sort of strange iPhones and much smaller upgrades overall compared to the iPhone 11 Pro. They do look a bit different. You've got those flat edges again, smaller bezels, but the same old notch and 60Hz refresh rate, which was a bit disappointing for a $1,000 phone in 2020. One positive is that the screen sizes did slightly increase, which I felt like was the right move, as the base size was now 6.1 inches from 5.8. The battery life, however, actually got a little worse, and there was just very little new headlining features to speak of. We saw LiDAR, which really wasn't that hype worthy, and then of course 5G networking, but this was a pretty weak iPhone upgrade all things considered. Even so, the design was really nice, and this wasn't a bad iPhone per se. It was more substantial than the XS, and I don't think it's one of the worst iPhones of all time, even if it's on the lower end of the spectrum. Fall 2021, we would see the iPhone 13 line starting with the 13 and 13 mini, direct successors to the 12 and 12 mini having the same size options, bringing minor technical upgrades, and crucially finally reducing the notch size. This was particularly welcome on the mini, since the notch naturally took up a greater portion of the display than it would have on a bigger phone. Battery life also got a good bit better, and while the 13 mini's battery has never been anything special, it was a decent improvement, and even to this day, the 13 mini is the best small smartphone ever made, period. Apple would ditch this form factor after this phone, and I really do think it's a real shame, because there is a small but dedicated group of users who prefer small phones over anything else and just don't have any more options. Both the 13 and 13 mini were great iPhones, and probably some of the best iPhones in recent years. I'd say they're the exact sort of upgrade you would like to see in a non-Pro iPhone. 2021 might be the final year where I can genuinely say I think Apple's iPhone lineup was really strong across the board, both in the aforementioned iPhone 13 and 13 mini, as well as the flagships in the 13 Pro and 13 Pro Max. These phones retain the same design as the 12 Pro, but brought Pro Motion. The display runs a refresh rate of 120 Hz, making the iOS experience just buttery smooth, and it's something I don't think I can live without ever since I owned my 13 Pro a few years back. We also saw a telephoto camera lens get a 3x zoom rather than the 2 of previous iPhones, which I think was a nice change. The notch was again smaller, and we saw the other general improvements. This was another year where battery life was just really good, particularly on the 13 Pro Max. We're spending enough time on these phones, so to boil it down, the entire iPhone 13 line was fantastic, and I really don't think Apple's matched it since. In early 2022, we would see the iPhone SE 3rd generation, which built on the 2nd gen with the A15 chipset, the same as in the iPhone 13, as well as 5G networking, which had been noticeably absent from the previous model and was basically a requirement for any brand new phone being sold at this point. And that's kind of it. No, really, that's practically all that was different here. We're still looking at the same old design, the same old camera sensors. This is by far the laziest iPhone Apple has ever made, and that's really saying something given the next devices we'll be looking at. Apple also raised the price from $400 USD to $430, which may not seem that dramatic an increase, and I guess it's not, but at best this phone was only okay-ish value right when it launched. And as we're entering 2025, it's still being sold at the exact same price. At this point, outside of the processor, the hardware is now over 7 years old. This is absolutely atrocious and an incredible display of greed on Apple's part. The only bright spots is that this isn't a terrible phone. It performs well enough even with weaker battery life, and for those who still swear by the home button, there just isn't any better option. But overall, this phone could definitely be the worst iPhone ever made and easily makes it to the next round. So I'm not sure what happened. 2021 was such a strong year for iPhone, but Apple just had to go and mess with a winning formula. Since the iPhone XR or even the 8 Plus, we had these really great iPhones aimed towards the higher end of the mid-range smartphone market. Phones that had basically all the same specs as their $1,000 counterparts, but with a missing camera lens and, outside of the iPhone 12, a downgraded display. But this time around, Apple got extremely lazy, and the result of this was the iPhone 14 and 14 Plus. Firstly, the mini option was gone, which sucks, but is at least understandable understandable given they were never selling that well to begin with, although these Plus models don't exactly sell like hotcakes either, but I digress. There is some benefit in them having pretty strong battery life, but that's about it. Thing is, this phone I'm showing right now, this is an iPhone 13, and there's zero way to actually tell the difference between it and the 14. Now that's not always a problem. Apple doesn't need to change up the design every single year, and these are sleek devices with the smaller notches and all, but what's insane is that we also still have the A15 chipset. Specifically, it's the chipset from the 13 Pro, which has a whole entire single GPU core more than the iPhone 13's A15 chip. Yeah, we also got 6 gigs of RAM rather than 4 on the 13, which is at least something, and should ensure better performance in the long run, but that's ultimately about it. This was a beyond pathetic upgrade. I can't even hardly call it an upgrade. It's absurd. And yet, they were selling the iPhone 14 at the same time as the 13 for an extra $100. Now in fairness, this is still a very good smartphone with good cameras and fast performance, but then the same can be said for the iPhone 13. And that's the problem, the fact that this phone did so little. If you own it and it works well for you, that's great, nothing wrong with that. My dad has one, he loves it, but this set a new low for iPhone upgrades, at least outside of the SE3, and it completely butchered the great pattern Apple had going with their mid-range devices, at least having the same speeds and main cameras as their better iPhones. The iPhone 14 and 14 Plus were really weak iPhone entries, and easily potentially the worst Apple has ever made. Along with the iPhone 14 and 14 Plus, we would also see the iPhone 14 Pro and 14 Pro Max fall 2022. Thankfully, these phones were far more substantial upgrades and did a lot to further refine the iPhone experience from the 13 Pro. We had actual tech spec improvements, the A16 Bionic chipset, and a new 48 megapixel camera sensor, which was a nice addition. The big headlining feature was of course the Dynamic Island, which I still think is very underrated. It allows for some really clever functionality and has turned what used to be an intrusive annoyance on iPhones in the notch into something that is perfectly integrated into the iOS experience and actually makes your life better. The design here was still the same as the 12 Pro, and I would say it was feeling a bit stale by this point. There was also the always-on display, which yeah, about time they added that, but I don't think the 14 Pro would win any awards for being one of the best iPhones of all time. Still, overall, a very solid entry. In 2023, we're getting there, we would see the iPhone 15 line, and starting with the iPhone 15 and 15 Plus, we finally have some upgrades to speak of. The biggest were clear from the get-go. You've got the Dynamic Island now along with USB-C, and while the display is still only 60Hz, I think it's still a livable compromise given the target audience for these phones. The design was slightly changed, and the color palette became a lot more pale, which I'm not a huge fan of, but I can appreciate Apple shaking things up even just a little bit. We got the 48 megapixel main camera sensor, as well as the A16 chipset, the same as was in the iPhone 14 Pro. I'm still unhappy this wasn't the same specs as the 15 Pro, but at least it's far better than what came before. The iPhone 15 and 15 Plus are ultimately pretty mid-tier iPhones, but they could have been far worse. Alongside the 15 and 15 Plus fall 2023, we would see the iPhone 15 Pro and 15 Pro Max. Apple would finally sorta change the design by switching from the stainless steel frame to titanium. This is something that's always felt like a nothing change to me, and early durability tests tended to show the 14 Pro may have in fact been more durable, but I do have to give credit to the 15 Pro for both being lighter and thinner than its predecessor, which was a nice change. We got the A17 Pro chipset, which is actually the oldest chip capable of running Apple Intelligence, so that's nice for those who are still using this phone. Of course, there's slightly thinner bezels, USB-C, the Dynamic Island is as dynamic as ever. One thing that was a bit odd was the 15 Pro Max got a 5x telephoto zoom, whereas the smaller 15 Pro stuck to 3x, but all in all, these are great phones, and while they may not be that exciting, I'm confident in saying they're nowhere near the worst Apple has had to offer. And finally, we come to the iPhone 16 line from fall 2024. The iPhone 16 and 16 Plus are still relatively new phones as of making this video, and have a mostly new design. The cameras are now oriented differently, and the colors I think are a lot more appealing than what the 15 had to offer, at least for myself. One big improvement here is that Apple does finally seem to be back on track with giving better tech specs to their mid-range options. If you can call these mid-range anyway, but you know what I mean. We've got the A18 chipset, which is a solid step up from the A16 and the iPhone 15, and this means this phone is fully capable of Apple Intelligence. This phone is almost actually great, except the display is still only 60Hz with no ProMotion, and it's starting to feel very absurd for an $800+ phone in 2024, I'm going to be honest. At absolute best, this phone is probably on the lower end of mid-tier for Apple's all-time iPhone lineup, but I don't think it's one of the worst, at least for the time being. And last but not least, also from fall 2024, we have the iPhone 16 Pro and 16 Pro Max. These were, at least to me, very disappointing upgrades. The screen sizes got slightly larger, which is something. The 5x zoom lens is now on both sizes, and we have the typical spec improvements with the A18 chipset, and now a 48 megapixel ultra-wide camera, which is nice. The bezels are ever so slightly thinner, and this is overall a great iPhone. Technically speaking, the best Apple has ever made, but it's also just so basic and feels really boring in the grand scheme of things. There's some typical Apple cheapness here too, like the base model coming with only 128 gigs, which feels pretty absurd for a $1,000 phone in 2024. These are again on the lower end of iPhones in my opinion, but I think it would be disingenuous of me to call them the worst. They're still really fast, really premium, and do hold their own against the other big flagships on the market. While this is the first time I haven't upgraded to a new iPhone since I bought the iPhone 10, as I'm still using my 15 Pro Max, that's more due to my own personal fatigue and disappointment and the lack of change in iPhones in recent years. Rumor has it this will 180 in 2025, but that doesn't make what we have right now in the moment any better. I have done a video that I'll link in the description below about how Apple's gotten more complacent in recent years. It's a 2-hour retrospective that is definitely brief, I promise, so maybe go check that out after this if you're interested. But for now, I don't believe the iPhone 16 Pro is one of the worst iPhones ever, it's just probably one of the most boring. Well, that took way too long, and I'm losing my voice, but we've finally gone through every single iPhone released prior to 2025, and of these, we've narrowed our pool of choices for the worst iPhone significantly. So let's go through what we have left, and then we'll do our best to determine a top 3. First, from 2011, we have the iPhone 4S, a phone with some real innovation with features like Siri, but one that suffers dramatically from horrible software optimization and performance in iOS 9, even if it did get 5 years of updates. Second, from 2013, we have the iPhone 5C, a phone that for all its fun colors did absolutely nothing to push the envelope and feels like a very pointless replacement for the iPhone 5 meant purely to save Apple some cash. Third, from 2014, we have the iPhone 6 and 6 Plus, the best-selling smartphones of all time, but also probably the iPhones with the most hardware issues ever. Fourth, from 2016, we have the iPhone 7 and 7 Plus, phones that didn't really bring much of an upgrade over the 6S, and of course infamously removed the headphone jack, which caused a ripple effect across the smartphone industry, where everyone else eventually did the same thing. Fifth, from 2018, we have the iPhone XS and XS Max, which had poor battery life and are some of the most minor iPhone upgrades of all time. Sixth, from 2022, we have the iPhone SE 3rd generation, a phone that's basically a minorly upgraded iPhone 8 at an absurd price tag for what you get, potentially screwing over any consumers on a budget who just want to buy the cheapest iPhone. And finally, our 7th contender, we have the iPhone 14 and 14 Plus, which might just be the smallest iPhone upgrades of all time, even accounting for the iPhone SE 3rd gen, with that phone at least jumping a couple processor generations. So there's our 7 iPhones out of the total 30 options we've discussed. I can't decide if this is a lot of iPhones or a pretty good number. I mean, overall 23% of iPhones being considered as potentially some of the worst ever certainly isn't great, but then again, even if all of these phones weren't as bad as they are, there would still be iPhones that could be considered some of the worst iPhones ever, right? Inevitably, some iPhone is going to be worse than another iPhone. But still, some of these are real stinkers if we're being honest. And I do think there's some clear outliers we can probably exempt right off the bat, as they just don't feel as terrible as the other phones. I think immediately we can probably drop the iPhone XS and XS Max. Yeah, they were lazy upgrades, but we do need to keep in mind the context of just how huge a jump the iPhone X was from the 7 and 7 Plus. Of course, Apple wasn't going to be able to do too much only a single year later, and while the battery life wasn't great, having a max size option was a very necessary addition. These are not the worst iPhones ever, at least in my eyes. Then I think we can also safely knock out the iPhone 7 and 7 Plus. Don't get me wrong, the headphone jack removal still gets me worked up, and I do believe it was a strictly anti-consumer move done purely to sell AirPods. No matter how many times Apple used the word courage in their almost ridiculously condescending presentation, if you watch it back, it's crazy. But there was some good here, particularly with the telephoto camera lens on the 7 Plus. That was a big step forward for the smartphone industry at large and deserves a lot of credit. Water resistance was great, the capacitive home button was great, and while the software support to only iOS 15 is a bit disappointing, 6 years is still a pretty solid timeline. The The 7 and 7 Plus are not the worst iPhones, even if they may be the most controversial. Next, I think we can also drop the iPhone 4S. As much as iOS 9 is absolutely brutal, and if there's ever been any example of planned obsolescence in iPhone, this would be it. The phone itself was still pretty great in 2011 with Siri, Apple's first dual-core chipset in the A5, an 8-megapixel camera that to this day can still take a half-decent photo. All in all, this probably was an underrated entry, and it may have been unfair for me to even include it on this list at all. But still, that iOS 9 performance was absolutely atrocious. It's just not enough to consider this the worst iPhone of all time. Finally, I think we can also drop the iPhone 6 and 6 Plus from the remaining contenders. Yeah, Bendgate and touch disease was an absolute disaster, and the design of these phones I think are a step down from the 5S. There also was very little technical improvement from the 5S, with really the only big change being that, well, these phones were now big. But that's still a major change for Apple at the time after years of sticking to the smaller form factor, and there is a reason these phones sold over 220 million units, a number completely unmatched by any other smartphone. It's not even close. People desperately wanted larger iPhones, and Apple finally provided, and these phones do have some charm. They're still the lightest iPhones ever made, for example, and you could tell Johnny Ive really put a lot into making something fresh and new for the next phase and era of iPhone. And he was successful, with this general design actually still being used even to this day with the iPhone SE 3rd generation. Sure, the iPhone 8 brought that glass back, but from the front, the iPhone 6 is practically identical to the 8-year newer smartphone. The fact that a design from 2014 could in any form still be sold in 2025, I mean, that's impressive, right? There was a lot of good here, and I do think it outweighs the bad overall. And now this leaves us with our final 3 options: the iPhone 5C, the iPhone SE 3rd generation, and the iPhone 14 and 14 Plus. Which of these is truly the worst iPhone ever made? Alright, so there's a lot to discuss with these phones, but first I'd like to knock out one more device to isolate our final 2. One of the problems I was having writing this video was in how exactly I wanted to judge each iPhone. How much do I weigh the context of the time period? How much do I consider the quality of the upgrade? And how do I account for the actual user experience? The last point is probably the big one. Realistically, if we went purely by how these phones hold up today, obviously basically any older iPhone would be among the worst, particularly when it comes to early iPhones like the 3G and how slow they became on later updates. So there has to be a balance there somewhere, but I do think usability needs to be one of the main factors considered, along with I believe the quantity and quality of the upgrades brought with any iPhone. What did they bring to the table that was new? Because if Apple's going to go out of their way to release a new iPhone, it needs to be doing something better or different from the previous model. Otherwise, what is the point of even making a new generation? What's unique about these 3 phones is that they were very minimal upgrades, if even upgrades in the first place. The iPhone 14 was just barely better than the 13 thanks to an extra GPU core and a little more RAM. The iPhone SE 3rd generation has a better processor and 5G, but completely ignored improving other areas that desperately needed an upgrade like the camera. And then you've got the 5C, which was just straight up an iPhone 5 repackaged into a plastic shell, making it arguably the worst of the bunch for this, but it did still at least have strong hardware even for 2013, thanks to the fact that the iPhone 5 was still pretty great. It was a solid foundation. So, user experience. Well, the iPhone 14 and 14 Plus, for all their flaws, are a fantastic experience. As said, my dad has an iPhone 14. I know a good few people with 14s, and I've never heard any complaints. Sure, the experience might only be negligibly better than the iPhone 13, but if it's still reliable and smooth and worth the price Apple is charging for its users, then who am I to complain? If people are paying the money required and are happy with the phone, then who am I to say they're wrong in any way? And I'm not saying that. It is a good phone. It's just not a good iPhone upgrade over the 13, right? The iPhone SE 3rd generation, on the other hand, is weaker here for sure. It's not going to be a very pleasant experience in 2025. It isn't slow, but the battery life alone is pretty terrible relative to other iPhones. The home button and older form factor might be an easy negative to point out, but I'm not opposed to that. Apple could keep selling a home button iPhone forever, and I would be fine with it, so long as the price point matches the value presented, and it doesn't with the SE. The camera, especially being 7 years old now, is just absurd. Even if photos are minimally better than like the iPhone 8 thanks to the extra processing power. But there's no night photography here, a basic feature that's been in iPhones for 5 years now. That is a half decade. It is absolutely ridiculous, and to charge $430 for all of this, all they had to do, reduce the price a little bit since 2022, but no, they won't do that. They'll just keep selling it until they replace it with a new iPhone SE, probably in 2025. This all genuinely makes me angry, and I've talked about it in a video before, but I still can't get over it. it's so ridiculous. Then there's the iPhone 5C, which at least in 2013 would have been a very pleasant experience, because again, it was just an iPhone 5 at its core. The value proposition for the time was pretty awful, but the actual hardware and experience was solid, at least for the most part. And I did get from iOS 7 to iOS 10, which admittedly isn't that many updates. Any iPhone since this has gotten more updates for some perspective. And so all this being said, I do think the odd man out here has to be the iPhone 14 and 14 Plus. Are they lazy iPhones? Absolutely. Could Apple have just kept selling the iPhone 13 and not even bother with making the 14 in the first place? Probably, but they were never going to do that. I guess they added the Plus option, but it's not like with the iPhone XS Max where it was a necessary addition. You already had Pro Max phones if you really wanted the larger size. And with the 14 line, we started to lose options as we don't have a mini size anymore. Again, I know people with iPhone 14s, but I can't think of one person I know who owns a 14 Plus, personally speaking at least. I definitely know people with mini iPhones, and a few of them are definitely unhappy they can't buy another one after this because Apple has left them behind. Ultimately though, the iPhone 14 and 14 Plus are still great phones for anyone actually using them right now, and I think that's enough to keep them from being considered the worst iPhones ever. I am curious how many updates they'll end up getting, but they've probably got at least another 4 years of iOS support remaining, so it will be a while before we really know how that all pans out. All in all, for the purposes of this video, the 14 and 14 Plus are not the worst iPhones of all time. This now leaves us down to the final two, the iPhone SE 3rd generation and the iPhone 5C. I feel like this isn't really a surprising duo. After all, both are phones that changed very little and provided lesser experiences than they should have for the price of admission. I'd say the SE3's value is worse than the 5C ever was, not when it came out right in 2022, but approaching 3 years later, oh boy, it is absolutely horrible value. Saving $100 and getting the 5C over the 5S was a straight up terrible investment in 2013. Don't forget the 5S got 2 extra years of updates, but buying a $430 iPhone SE in 2025 is just flat out highway robbery on Apple's part. What the SE does have going for it is that the core of the phone, much like the 5C, is still solid. The A15 chip is powerful and it holds its own for the time being and will continue to do so for the foreseeable future. You're probably looking at least a few more major iOS updates, and that's respectable, especially considering the home button form factor. I mean, how many phones can you find these days that look like this? For that very small, niche group of users who live and die by the home button, this is as good as you will ever have it. The iPhone SE 3rd generation has so many flaws. It's overpriced, it's underpowered, it's using what amounts to basically the same design as a phone that Apple released in 2014. But despite all of that, I do believe the iPhone 5C is the worst iPhone ever. There's some stark differences between the SE and 5C that I think puts the older phone over the edge. For one thing, the SE has never been postured as one of Apple's best iPhones, although they do have some stuff on their website that feels awfully misleading, like serious power, serious value, which is just objectively untrue, Apple. But the SE3 came in March 2022. It was the cheapest iPhone right from the get-go, and it's not a phone that you would buy expecting a brand new flagship experience. It's a phone that you bought because you either wanted the home button or you just wanted the cheapest iPhone available. If you buy an iPhone 16 today, you expect something really good, something new, something fresh, and it is. The SE was never that. The 5C, on the other hand, came out right alongside the iPhone 5S and was marketed just as heavily, if not even more so. Apple was really pushing this thing, and that's a large reason why it's still considered their biggest flop ever, at least for iPhones. And while it did sell quite well, it really didn't perform anywhere near their expectations. And that's one thing I think is crucial too, the disconnect between Apple and their consumers. They really thought the 5C was going to be the next big thing and planned for that by cranking up the supply, and then it did just only okay and nowhere nearly as good as the 5S did. It's sort of like these newer Plus model iPhones. They don't sell well because people just aren't willing to spend more for a bigger screen when they could already get a sizable display on the iPhone 14 or whatever. If they're wanting to spend more, they'll spend it on a Pro model iPhone. So with the iPhone 5C, if you were going to go out and buy a new iPhone, you were going to get the one that was actually new. This disconnect between Apple and their customers crops up here and there, and in contrast, sometimes they're fantastic at making the perfect device right at the perfect time. The 2016 iPhone SE is essentially the 5C done right. It took a design that was cheaper for Apple to produce, was more affordable than their main flagship, but they didn't cheap out on the internals and leave it a generation behind. Instead, it was straight up just a mini iPhone 6S, but the 5C was just an iPhone 5. Literally all Apple had to do was throw in something, anything, to make it somewhat on par with the 5S, but they they couldn't do it. Imagine having Touch ID on the 5C. Yeah, that alone would have made the phone sell significantly better and would have helped massively justify that price tag. But no, instead Apple relied on the hype surrounding having more colors for iPhone now, and that just wasn't ever going to be enough to carry sales. There was also this strange distinction between the 5C and every iPhone that came before it. Yeah, iPhones had been plastic before, but it was a different time where smartphones were extremely new conceptually, and Apple needed to drive their prices down to grow the market. By the time we hit 2013, smartphones are huge, and you really have two big giants on the block. Samsung, who were making phablet phones with really vibrant, beautiful displays that were much larger, but their build quality wasn't that great. It was plastic and nowhere near as premium or luxurious as an iPhone. They did, however, have accessibility, with expandable storage and swappable batteries, as well as the freedom Android brings. But the simplicity and feeling of polish of iPhone was completely unmatched. I remember even as like a 13-year-old feeling like Samsung phones were inferior because they were made of plastic. Yeah, dumb thing to think in such a black and white manner. Just because I liked one phone better doesn't mean the other one doesn't have its pros. But even so, I know for a fact I wasn't the only one who thought that way. But then Apple goes out and makes a plastic phone themselves, except without any of the benefits that normally would come with a cheaper material. They over-engineered the heck out of that polycarbonate shell, and yeah, I do think it was really gorgeous and extremely comfortable in the hand. Plus, you realistically didn't need a case, although Apple had you covered with their weirdest case of all time if you did want one. But all this didn't matter when the customer base buying your phones expect a certain level of premium from these devices. You also weren't going to win over new customers from Samsung when you still didn't have any SD card slots or really any benefit to the plastic whatsoever. It was just plastic for the sake of what, being plastic, having colors? The aluminum and glass of the iPhone 5 was objectively just a higher quality material, and so the plastic 5C seemed cheap in comparison, despite not having a price tag to match that notion. Again, you're looking at that disconnect between Apple and the real-life customer looking to buy a new iPhone. Why would you ever buy the 5C when you get none of the cool new features from the 5S? Only the same hardware as the nicer looking iPhone 5, or at least more premium looking is probably the better way to say it, and all you really get out of this is saving $100 by not going for the 5S. And it's funny because I do love the 5C, and as mentioned, I owned one myself back in the day. It's fun, it's quirky, it stands out from the crowd of aluminum and glass we've come to expect from Apple. It's such a unique phone, and even just having all these colors I think really was a nice addition, but it wasn't really a true selling point, and Apple never should have treated it like one. What I believe really clinches the 5C as the worst iPhone ever is the long-term performance of the device. We only got 4 years of iOS updates. It came on iOS 7, then we had 8, 9, and 10, and that was it. Any iPhone since then has had at least 5 years of updates, with the shortest span being the iPhone 6, getting iOS 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Still, performance on iOS 10 is fine, unless of course you're one of the unfortunate souls who made the mistake of purchasing an 8GB model. When the 5C originally launched, it came with at least 16 gigs, but because those weren't selling, Apple wanted to get it cheaper, and the way they did this was in 2014 by introducing an 8GB variant, and holy crap, that wasn't enough space then, never mind by 2016 when these things were now receiving iOS 10. Don't forget, the actual amount of usable space is different from that 8GB number. At most, you might have a few gigs to work with if you're lucky at any time, so if you took any photos or videos or dared to install a few apps, or you updated your phone, which always seemed to take up more and more storage every year, you were just going to be in for a really rough time here. And storage management is just one side of that coin, because if you've ever had an iPhone full on storage, you'll know it can be an almost unusable experience. Even ignoring those irritating pop-ups that constantly bug you, things can slow down to a crawl, and on software like iOS 10 that doesn't run fantastically to begin with, well, you get the idea. If you were to be really specific, the 8GB iPhone 5C is in fact the worst iPhone ever sold, and it's really not that close. The 8GB iPhone 4S is up there as well, for the record, which was introduced in 2013, and that phone on iOS 9 would be an even worse experience, absolute nightmare fuel, but at least that 4S came at a time where 8GB was slightly more acceptable than it was in 2014 onwards. And of course, there's a lot of good that came with the 4S, so when we're looking at these things as a whole, I still don't think it's the worst iPhone. The iPhone 5C was an absolute failure by Apple standards, and an ominous sign for this new era of Apple and iPhone. iOS 7 visibly showed the new direction. It was more flat and colorful. It showed Apple trying something new. And the 5S, it showed that Apple was still able to innovate and push their hardware forward. The first 64-bit chipset in a smartphone, that was really impressive, and it's why it got so many updates. But then there's the other side of things, the 5C, showing the greedy side of Apple, one that didn't make a phone to please the customers, but a phone to please the shareholders. A phone they thought would make them a ridiculous amount of money, and it probably did, but definitely not nearly as much as they wanted. And I'm thankful that's how it went, because after the 5C we got some great phones like the iPhone SE, the iPhone XR, the iPhone 12, and so on. Apple sort of had to learn a lesson there. The XR obviously has a lot in common with the 5C, bringing back all the colors, and it's just such a shame that since the iPhone 14, these mid-range iPhone models are again showing a bit of that disconnect. Supposedly the iPhone 16 line is doing pretty poorly in sales, and if Apple didn't see this coming, then they really need to reconsider their priorities. They need to look back, see the failure that was the 5C, and recognize why everything went wrong. No one would be complaining about things like 60 Hz on the iPhone 16 if it was a couple $100 cheaper. So you either need to make those mid-range models better, or you need to lower the price. 2025 is going to be a make or break year for Apple, and you know what? I'm actually pretty optimistic, all things considered. And for now, the iPhone 5C still stands as the worst iPhone ever made, at least to my own evaluation. And I'm very curious on your guys' thoughts, so make sure you please leave a comment down below. I want to hear your opinions. And so with that, we've reached the conclusion of this video. For those of you who've been around for a long time, I actually did do a similar video to this all the way back in 2018. Now that video was a lot less detailed and much shorter, but there were also way fewer iPhones back then. I think that video was made before the iPhone XS and XR, but even if we include those phones, there were only a total of 16 iPhones by the end of 2018. Since 2019, we've seen 14 more new iPhones in only 5 short years. That is pretty wild to me, so I do think it was justified to make this video again. A lot has changed, even if the end results ended up being the same. Calling the iPhone 5C the worst iPhone ever almost feels like cheating, like it's just the easy answer everyone expects, but I do think it fits the bill better than anything else. In fact, I really don't think by this point it's really possible for Apple to hit a new low. For one, they've got experience, and they don't need to experiment so much anymore, which makes for less odds they do something really dumb or outlandish. But beyond just that, technology has advanced to the point where even a relatively underpowered smartphone like the SE3 in 2025 is still a fine experience and will remain that way for the duration of its life. Back in 2013, with the 5C using 2012 hardware, it was a lot more difficult to future-proof these devices for eventual updates. The specs at the time just couldn't keep up with the software, and while iOS 10 isn't a terrible experience, it's still a bit slow and would be atrocious again on that 8GB model. That's another thing, we've at least had a semi-reasonable amount of storage in most phones since this point. I do think the 16GB iPhone 6S and SE is pretty dang brutal, especially on iOS 15, but hey, even that has to be a bit more usable than an 8GB 5C, right? The iPhone 5C is the worst iPhone ever made, but it's also the most unique. It showed a very different Apple from the one we see today, a time where they did experiment and push their own boundaries, redefining what an iPhone was and could be. Since the iPhone 10, what we've gotten hasn't felt nearly as new or fresh year to year, with smartphone progress as a whole slowing down to a crawl. I mean, they're just so good already, it makes sense iPhone may have already surpassed its peak. And that again is a video I did a few months back. I poured a ton of time into that 2-hour retrospective, so make sure you please go check that out if you want some more juicy iPhone content. Link in the description. But for now, I think I'm done rambling here. If you found this video interesting, please hit that like button and consider subscribing for more content just like this. And we do have a Discord server with a great community. Come by, say hi. Huge shout out to the channel members for being absolutely amazing people. Thank you guys for sticking around, and thank you all so much for watching. Without further ado, I am Josh from 91 Tech, and I will see you all next time.